Hi there guys, welcome to another A-level biology video. Mr. Phillips, and today we're looking at heart structure, and what we're going to be focusing on is first of all reminding you about the double circulatory system, then applying that to the heart structure itself, looking at the cardiac cycle and the pressures that happen during the cardiac cycle, the changes of pressure, looking at coronary heart disease, and looking at the causes of heart disease. So you should know from what we've done in another video that there is something called a double circulatory system. So if I do this in a black pen so it stands out a bit more, the blood comes back, let's say, from the body via the vena cava into the right atrium of the heart. It goes down to the right ventricle where it's then pumped out by the pulmonary artery to the lungs. It picks up oxygen there, becomes oxygenated, returns via the pulmonary vein to the left atria, and then goes down to the right left ventricle, before being pumped out of the aorta and to the rest of the body. And that then is called a double circulatory system because it goes through the heart not once, but twice for every circuit of the body, and that's all in the previous video. Now that obviously links to the structure of the heart, so you need to be able to talk your way through the structure of the heart and the path that blood would take. So as I just said, blood, if we imagine it's coming from any part of the body, so the respiring tissues in the body, the blood comes back from the body's cells and from the capillaries, where they've dropped off oxygen, picked up carbon dioxide, and the deoxygenated blood then comes via the vena cava. And there's 2 points to the vena cava. Vena cava that comes from below the heart is the inferior vena cava. The vena cava comes from above the heart, joins with the other one to come, and it's called the superior vena cava. That then heads into the right atrium. So just to remind you, it's as if you're operating on somebody, so you'd be facing the opposite way around to them. So you've got the right atrium there, and then the blood fills down into, partially from just being open valves and partially from being squeezed in the right atrium, into the right ventricle. So all this blood is deoxygenated at the moment. And when the right ventricle contracts in the heartbeat, blood is forced up and out through the pulmonary artery, and that blood goes to the lungs. And it splits into two because there's two lungs, so don't forget about that. And in the lungs, it collects oxygen, it drops off carbon dioxide via diffusion, obviously, and then it comes back via the pulmonary vein into the left atrium. Okay, and then that blood goes down into the left ventricle, and then the blood is squeezed at extremely high pressure, and it goes through and out the aorta and to the body. Okay, so it goes back around to the body, and that can be up to your head as well. So what extra things do you need to know? Well, if you look at the difference between the right ventricle muscle level and the left ventricle is much thicker because it needs to push the blood all the way to the heart, from the heart to the rest of the body. So it has to be under very high pressure at that point. So there's high muscles, thick muscles there, to mean they can contract with high levels of force, which increase the pressure of the blood very high. And we've obviously got valves in the heart. Okay, so we've got the right and left atrioventricular valves here and across the other side as well, and they stop the backflow. So when the ventricles contract, they close due to the pressure. So you can see what we'll talk about in a second. And then there are also valves called the semilunar valves, which are again both sides, and they stop the blood. Once the blood has left the heart, they stop it returning from the pulmonary artery or the aorta. And if you imagine here on the right hand side, when there's really high pressure, they get pushed open because of their shape, but when the pressure then drops back in the heart, the blood will come down, but it gets caught in these pockets that prevent the blood getting back into the heart. And that's what makes the sound, the lub-dub sound of a heartbeat, the lub-dub, lub-dub, because it stops the closing of the valves is what you can actually hear. So there you go, and you can link it there to the actual whole structure. As we've said before, you need to know where the blood supply comes in and where the blood supply goes out of the heart. So that links us to the cardiac cycle. So this is the stages in one single heartbeat to move blood through the heart. And where we're going to start is from the, and it's difficult to say whether there's a certain start here, but we're going to start here with atrial systole. And the word systole is one that you probably don't need to know anymore, but it means contraction, whereas diastole means relaxing. So we're going to start with the atrium contracting, and obviously you can see here from a different diagram that that's going to force the blood into the ventricles. Because of the shape of the valves, the atrial ventricular valves will open, and that will push that contraction of the atria, decreases the volume in the atria and increases the pressure, pushing the blood down into the ventricles. Okay, and as the ventricles fill up with blood, their pressure is going to start to increase, because as they get slowly full of blood, obviously there's less volume, less spare volume in those ventricles. So that is atrial systole, and it's up to you where you start really. There's no right or wrong here, but I would recommend probably starting describing your heartbeat in that stage there. So then the second one is ventricular systole, and again that just means the ventricles are contracting. So when the ventricles contract, the atria relax, and that means the valves have got to do their job. So you see here on this diagram here, the valves, because the pressure of the blood will be forced behind them, forces the valves closed, so no blood can get back into the atria. And then the pressure will increase because the volume of the ventricles will decrease. Okay, so the green arrows here is showing the ventricle volume decreasing. That increases the pressure dramatically, and eventually the pressure will become much greater than even in the pulmonary artery, which is here, and I'm writing number 1 now, and in the aorta, which is number 2 here. And basically what happens is the semilunar valves are there to prevent backflow once the blood actually leaves, but they actually stay shut and they only open in some spurts when the pressure in the ventricles becomes great enough to push that blood past. We then get to the last stage, which is diastole. Okay, and this is where both the atria and ventricle relax. And it's effectively where the atria start filling full of blood. So blood from the vena cava then and the pulmonary vein obviously fills the the atria there, and goes into the ventricle as well, because the valves will be open. That is the atria ventricle. So a popular application question for this, which is often one that people struggle with, is looking at the pressure changes in each chamber of the heart as these events happen. So again, if we start with atrial systole, which is when again the atria contract, okay, and the ventricles are relaxed, let's have a look at what this graph shows here. So if I write numbers to sort of make it as clear as possible. So what we've got here is the pressure in the aorta, which is the main artery leaving the heart to the body. We've got the pressure in the ventricles. The red one at the bottom is the pressure in the atria, and then there's the ventricle volume. We'll come to that later. So if we start off at number 1. So at number 1, we could see the pressure which would be happening in atrial systole, okay, which don't forget links to this part here, number 1. The atria are contracting, therefore they have slightly more pressure than the ventricles, which are in orange, and therefore blood moves from the atria into the ventricles. But as you can see on the graph, as the atria start to push all the blood into the ventricles, the ventricle pressure will then eventually increase over the atria. And at this point, because there is no blood in the ventricles, or very little blood, very little pressure in the ventricles, the semilunar valves, which are being addressed here, are closed. So before, if I write point X there, before that point, the semilunar valves, which control the blood leaving the atria and stop it coming back in, stopping the blood from returning to the ventricles, they are closed. So then we enter ventricle systole, which is when the ventricles contract. And ventricle systole, when the ventricles contract, as I said, means the ventricles are contracting, getting smaller, the volume is decreasing, which this green line would have showed if I hadn't covered it with a picture. And that means the volume is getting smaller, so the pressure in the ventricles is going to rapidly increase as they contract greatly. And at point Y, if I call it that here, okay, the pressure in the ventricles becomes greater than the pressure in the atria, so the atrioventricular valves will close to stop that backflow, and you can see that happening here in this diagram. So their ventricles are contracting, we can't afford the blood to backflow into the atria, which now has a lower pressure, so the atrioventricular valves close. Now, as the ventricles contract, their volume decreases, their pressure massively increases, and as I said to you, the semilunar valves stay shut until the pressure in the ventricles is so great it is higher than the pressure in the aorta or in the pulmonary vein, and they temporarily open. And if I write that here on point X on the picture, to release the blood out of the ventricles, and they stay open for as long as the ventricle pressure is higher than the pressure in the aorta in this side, which would be the left side of the heart. As soon as the ventricle finishes contracting and its volume starts to increase again, and also it's run out of blood, its pressure starts to drop. Okay, and once it drops, if I point Z here, okay, the semilunar valves have to close to prevent the backflow of blood back into the heart. Okay, and what will happen is the pressure of the pressure will actually temporarily increase in the aorta as the blood tries to go back, but it can't, and the valve snaps shut. And then obviously as the blood moves away, the pressure starts to drop. The ventricle pressure drops down as the ventricles relax, and at this point in diastole, so we're at number 3 on the yellow bit on the pie chart. That bit then is where both the ventricles and the atria are relaxed, and the volume is therefore going to be as high as it can be, and the pressure is going to drop. But then the blood starts filling up again, so the pressure, the atria start filling with blood as they're both relaxed from the vena cava and the pulmonary vein, and therefore the pressure in the blood, if I just say a point on a B, therefore becomes greater in the atria because it's filling up with blood, so then the atrioventricular valves can open. So it's really important to be able to talk your way through that, and make sure you do spend time reading that if you don't understand everything I've just gone through, because it is an essential part of the course. So then some maths for you to do here is a bit about cardiac output. So cardiac output equals stroke volume, and stroke volume is the volume of blood centimeters cubed that is pumped to each heartbeat, and the heart rate is the number of beats per minute. So an easy question would be literally calculate your cardiac output if you have a stroke volume of 70 centimeters cubed with a beat of 75 beats per minute. So you just do 70 times 75, which would equal that. To make it a little bit difficult, you might have to rearrange the equation. So I've done it like sort of how I teach GCSE here. If cardiac output equals stroke volume times heart rate, you can rearrange the equation using the triangle. To calculate stroke volume, you would do your cardiac output and divide that, by heart rate as a result. Okay, so cardiac output is 5440 divided by the heart rate of 80 equals 68 centimeters cubed, and you can also do it with the heart rate as well. But hopefully that's relatively straightforward. So a section that you might be asked some questions about then is cardiovascular disease, and I might try and do a separate video in a bit more detail for these with you as soon as I can. But effectively these are often linked to data questions, but you need that basic understanding to be able to explain each of these diseases and apply it to data. So the first type of cardiovascular disease, and cardiovascular disease is any disease of the heart or the blood vessels to do with the heart. So the first type is an atheroma. And an atheroma basically is the idea that there's damage to the artery and your body tries to respond to help it. So effectively, this is a healthy artery here, okay, and one thing that should happen is the endothelium lining should be nice and smooth to allow minimum friction and allow the blood to go through, and it should be unbroken. But if you get high blood pressure, what can happen is it can start damaging this lining. And when it damages the lining, what happens is we try and block that damage by putting white blood cells and fat lumps in there, cholesterol, things like that in there. And it often just builds up under where it gets into the gap, which fixes it for us to make sure we don't lose blood or anything, but it gets under the gap. And then over time, if you've got a particularly high fat diet, more and more fat starts building up and building up. And then what will happen is this forms a solid plaque. So we use the word plaque in our teeth and things like that, but fibrous plaque means it's basically build up of fatty material that becomes solid underneath the lining then of your endothelium, because it just keeps collecting it up. And eventually it pushes out and it pushes out and it pushes out, and it can obviously burst through the actual endothelium as well, but it basically slows down the blood flow going through the artery by restricting the cross section up of the artery, and that means you'll be getting less oxygen, less glucose where you need it, but the blood pressure will increase because you've got less space for the blood to flow through, and that can increase the damage even more. Now that atheroma then links to other diseases. So one is an aneurysm. So this is when you get a balloon-like swelling from the atheroma. So basically the plaque damages the artery, narrowing it and increasing the blood flow. And what can happen is that increased pressure can cause the inner layers of the artery to actually push out the side of the artery, and that can fill up like a balloon. And if that bursts, it's like it forming a hemorrhage, and you basically are internally bleeding as a result. So obviously very serious and increased risk by increased blood pressure. Then there's something called a thrombosis. So thrombosis is where, again, you've got your atheroma and it bursts through the endothelium lining as a result. And when it bursts through the endothelium lining, it makes a rough surface. So instead of that nice smooth surface that you've had, this area now coloured in blue would be rough. Okay, that then means more platelets will attach to it, and the protein fibrin, which if you know about blood clots, will attach to that, and it forms a blood clot, and that can obviously be serious, and it can stop materials flowing through, and if it happens in your brain, it can lead to stroke. If it happens in the heart, it can lead to a heart attack. Now your heart is a muscle, and just to point out, your heart needs oxygen and well, it's actually fatty acids, but oxygen to respire itself, and it doesn't get these through the main methods of pathways of blood through the heart. That's its job. It has a separate artery on the outside called a coronary artery, and the coronary artery, hence coronary artery heart disease, supplies it with oxygen for respiration. So what can happen is you can have a myocardial infarction or a heart attack, and that's when there's a blockage in this artery which stops the cells from getting oxygen. So let's say there's a blockage there. That means all the cells below that point will suffer and get less oxygen or possibly no oxygen, and that can then damage the heart muscles because they're not able to respire. And the symptoms of that can be anything from chest pain to shortness of breath to sweating to obviously just collapsing and having a massive heart attack. And it depends where it forms. If you get a blockage there, it's going to be quite serious, but if you get a blockage at the top of here, that's going to damage more of your cells in the heart, and as a result it's going to cause more issues. Now, risk factors for heart disease are obviously quite important. So high blood pressure is a massive risk factor, because if you get high blood pressure, there's more likely to be damage to your arteries, and therefore you're more likely to get an atheroma formation. Okay, if you're more likely to get an atheroma formation, you're more likely to get blood clots, and that is more likely to lead to a myocardial infarction. But also, don't forget, it could lead to an aneurysm as well. High blood cholesterol or a poor diet, and this is how much cholesterol will be classed as high blood cholesterol in your blood. That again can lead to high blood pressure, linked to high blood pressure as well. Having a poor diet from high salt and high cholesterol can cause, when you get the atheroma, to form a lot quicker. That can lead to blood clots, and again that can lead to myocardial infarction. And there's one for smoking as well, similar thing. There is a cholesterol added into your cigarettes, so that's an issue that can lead to that. Smoking increases blood pressure because nicotine increases blood pressure, and therefore that again can lead to that situation there. Also, smoking damages the arteries again, which then will lead to increased formation of atheroma as well. Now, some risk factors are unavoidable, including like genetic predispositions and also other conditions such as diabetes, for example. If you have those conditions, obviously that is an issue because you can't get rid of those risk factors, but it does allow you to try and lower other risk factors to try and reduce the chance of getting a heart disease later on. So I've covered heart disease quite quickly there. I will try and do a video at a later date on that, but I think that's enough to give you a good idea to work through. Remember, it's often data driven when it comes to heart disease questions in exams. Hope that's been useful, guys. I'll see you again soon.